Chapter 6, Genetics and Personality. So in this chapter, we are looking at how our biological systems, all of our physiological systems, how they work with, connect with, interact with the environment, our thoughts, our behaviors, our feelings. Okay, how does that all work together to produce our personality? So one of the stories it talks about, it's a famous story of the Jim twins. And these were twins that, identical twins that were separated at birth, right? So they were adopted away and they went and lived with different families. Then, 39 years later, they met up somehow, reconnected, got together, and found out that they had lived miraculously similar lives. So they were both the same height, they're both married twice. Their first wife was Linda. This gets a little crazy. Second wife was Betty. Well, you can read the list there. Those are maybe coincidences, but I mean, they both smoked and drank beer. They had the same headaches, which maybe makes a little more sense since they share all the same genes. Similar scores on personality tests, which sort of suggest a link between having the same genes and having similar personalities. So, anyways, this brought to the forefront. They had separate environments. They lived in different places. So it sort of suggests that genes, our genetic makeup, has a strong impact on our personality and the choices that we make in our lives, the people that we attract into our lives or that we are attracted to. So this is what we're going to be talking about. So this first part, we will definitely be getting through, I'm hoping this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? This first half here. We're going to talk about the genome, talk about some genes and personality, some controversy around that, the goal of behavioral genetics, and then what is heritability? Those are the numbers that we look at when we're looking at the difference between a genetic contribution to something and an environmental, right? Then we look into behavioral genetic methods. So how do we study behavioral genetics? How do we tease out the impact of environment versus the impact of your genetic makeup? Okay, so let's dive in here. The first part's a bit of a biology lesson, okay? So what is a genome? A genome is your entire genetic makeup. It's in one cell, okay? It's your complete set of genes, your blueprint for physiologically what you're going to be, what your potential is, your whole map. So the genome contains about 30 to 80,000 genes on 23 pairs of chromosomes. Most genes in the human genome are the same for all humans. So this makes sense that most of our genes are all the same. That's why we all have 2 eyes, we have 2 ears, we have 10 fingers. We all have basically the same parts. That's because we all have the same genes, except for tiny little differences that make us different. So a small number of genes are different for different individuals, including genes that indirectly code for physical traits and personality traits. So those tiny differences are why some of us have blue eyes, some have brown, some of us are maybe more dominant or aggressive than others or more conscientious than others, different personality traits. So why is there controversy about studying genes and personality? Like, why is that possibly problematic? Why do people get, up in arms, as they say, about studying genes and personality? There's 2 main reasons. One, the most obvious, concerned about eugenics. Because if we can identify genes and why people are the way they are, or what genes promote positive characteristics that we want, or personality characteristics that we want. We could design the perfect human, right? So that is a concern. And then the other concern is more ideological. People like to, the idea that if we say that a particular personality trait or behavior is caused by genetics, then they're saying, well, if it's caused by genetics, then we can't change, right? It also takes away the idea that we have free will. It challenges that assumption that humans have free will. Somehow we are higher than the animals in that sense. Modern behaviorist genetics who study personality. So what do we do with this? So typically very careful about addressing implications of their work. So they do study it. You just have to be a little careful about what you're studying and what the implications are, right? And sensitive to ideological concerns. Their argument is, if we find out that it's better to find out that a particular personality trait is genetic rather than not know it, right? Knowledge is better than ignorance. Finding out that a personality trait has a genetic component does not mean that the environment is powerless to modify the trait. So finding out, for example, that aggressiveness is genetic, it's better to know that, right? And then you'd want to know, okay, so what, and hyperactivity, say in children, it's better to know to what degree is that genetic. Because if we know that it's 80% genetic, we can stop blaming the parents about poor parenting practices, right? Although, I mean, and then also in this, it does say, it doesn't mean the environment is powerless. It just means it's good to know to what extent it is genetic. Okay, so knowledge is better than ignorance is their argument. The goals of behavioral genetics, it's to determine the percentage of individual differences of a trait that can be attributed to genetic differences and what can be attributed to environmental differences. So individual differences in a trait. So if some people are more, like I said, say conscientious than others, to what degree is that genetic and to what degree is that environmental? Determine the ways in which the genes and environment interact and correlate with each other to produce individual differences. And when you have these numbers, when you do this research, another goal is you can determine precisely where in the environment, where does this impact, or where are these differences, where are they coming from, so that we can take a look at those. Are they coming from parental socialization? Are they coming from different teachers? Are they coming from social media? Where are these differences coming from? So one example of differences is to do with height. We know that 90% is due to genetics. Another screen in here, or sometimes you'll run into a number that'll say 85 is due to genetics. It's approximately 90, okay, of height is due to genetics. The environment is 10%. So that research has been done. What is important to note here too is that 10% may seem small. When you look at this, you might think, well, hey, 90% is genetics, so there's not much of an impact, right? It's kind of set out by your genetic code. But if you look at this difference across time, that 10% really adds up. For example, I think in the past, 30 or 40 years, the average height in North America has increased by 5 centimeters. I Googled Japan. Some of my family lives in Japan. And when I was over there, I noticed a lot of the older people were quite petite. My kid's grandmother, she must have been about 4'10", or she is about 4'10". And the neighbors around, the elderly neighbors, they were all like under 5 feet. But then when you go downtown Osaka, the young people, some of them were as tall as me. Some of them were 5'7", some of them 5'9". And the difference of this, I was about to ask you the difference, but we're in a video. A lot has to do with diet, right? The grandparents, they grew up eating fish and rice and vegetables, and the young people now are eating red meat. So a big difference in their diet, and if you look that up, I believe that in Japan, the difference in height has increased up to 15 centimeters. So that 10% really does add up. Okay, some terms that we need to know. So heritability, it is a statistic that refers to the proportion of observed variance in a group of individuals that can be accounted for by genetics. We're going to look at some examples, okay? So let's go to genotype first. Genotype refers to individual differences in the total collection of genes possessed by each person. Your genotype is your blueprint. It is what is in the blueprint. The phenotype is what you see. Okay, so your genotype, your gene could have a print, but it's got dominant and recessive genes. So just because you have genotype, say for blue and for brown eyes, your phenotype is what you see if you have blue eyes. That's the one that was expressed. Okay, so remember, phenotype is what you see. And then environmentality, proportion of observed variance in a group of individuals attributed to the environment. That's sort of straightforward. So, example, heritability of 0.2 means that 0.2%, 20% of individual differences may be observed to genetic variation, 80% due to the environment. It's not for I. That's just a picture, by the way. Depression, estimated genetic heritability of 0.4. And intelligence is 0.6 to 0.8. Intelligence is one of the strongest heritability factors. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Quick section on misconceptions about heritability. It cannot be applied to a single individual. It refers to differences in a sample or a population. So when you're talking about differences in height, you can't say, well, the heritability of that is 90, so why are my parents tall and I'm short? It's not about one person or a few. It's about the entire population. And it is not a precise statistic. It's an estimate only. So when we say 0.9 for height, it is not a rock solid 0.9, right? It's an estimate. That's also why you'll see windows for intelligence like 0.6 to 0.8. We'll also talk a little bit more about the range. Okay, nature-nurture debate clarified. There's no debate at the individual level, right? There is no debate which is more important, genes or the environment, and accounting for David. There's not one. You're looking at the population, so humans, right, as a species. Influence of genes and environment is only relevant for discussion of group-level variation. So you can partition out the differences when you're looking at large groups of people. And you can compare them with other groups of people, but never on an individual basis. Oh, so that's the first section there. If we were in class, we'd be coming up with 2 questions each. But we will play that game next time. And here we are at 14 minutes, so we are going to stop here, and I will do behavioral genetics methods in the next video.